Thank you. Thank to the committee for inviting me and to all of you for sticking around through to the last talk. So my team's job at LinkedIn is to protect our members from fraud and abuse of all types. And we have a lot of members. We have more than 400 million registered members from all over the world, from more than 200 countries. We're localized in 24 languages. And we see a broad diversity of members using LinkedIn for many different purposes: send messages, post resumes, marketing, get hired, etc. And unfortunately, the vast majority of these members are not security experts. So they're probably not going to take the kind of proactive measures to make themselves and their accounts secure that people in this audience would. So one of the things that we need to protect them against is their accounts being taken over. And this is, unfortunately more common than you would hope, because members, the generic member is probably not so good at protecting their password and wouldn't do the sorts of things that you would do. So someone in this audience would never use one of the most common passwords as exposed in various password breaches. You certainly wouldn't reuse your passwords across different websites, and especially a site that got hacked, and then therefore leaving your account open to someone who collects those credentials. Certainly wouldn't get phished or tell your password to somebody who then uses it against you after a falling out. But unfortunately, not everybody is as secure as you are. And we want to protect all of our members, not just those who are actively conscious about their security. So what are we going to do? I guess first, with a bit of an aside, why should we be worried about this? What are the attackers looking for when they take over LinkedIn accounts? And we see spam. And in a social network, if you get spam, it looks more legitimate if it's from somebody you know. Right? So we see people taking over accounts and sending messages to their connections, and those connections guards could be down. There's also valuable data. Right? People have private messages or business data or personal, or even knowing what people's connections are would be valuable to an attacker. So we need to protect our members from these types of threats. So one thing that we can try to do is try to force better passwords. So there's various techniques. We could put password strength meters in. These have been shown to have some effect at creating higher entropy passwords. You could require certain complexity levels in passwords. Also has been shown to have some effect, but has the downside of making passwords harder to remember, maybe leading to increased reuse across sites. Password managers, I'm sure most of you use them to manage all of your various internet accounts. These generate secure, unique passwords for every site you visit. But of course, this is an opt-in process, right? You have to know that this is the protection you're looking for if you're going to use a password manager. So there's a bunch of research on avoiding passwords altogether. Can we do something else? Right? If we can't make the passwords themselves more secure, what can we do? Well, there's obviously two-step verification. Right? We log in, you send a code to your phone. LinkedIn has a solution. I hope all of you are opted in to LinkedIn's two-step verification. But of course, as you might guess, this being an opt-in process, the adoption rate is low. And again, it's not going to protect the vast majority of our members. There's more theoretical research on biometric identifiers. This has been shown to actually have some usability properties, but it's not been deployed at scale. Would require changing users' behavior. There are also a number of sites out there, this is a trend we've seen, that do away with passwords entirely. Instead of logging in with a password, you get a link on your phone or email that you click to authenticate. But this just pushes the problem down to the email provider or to the the mobile provider, and doesn't really do anything to solve the core problem. So when we're thinking about account compromise on LinkedIn, we really have to assume the worst, right? We have to assume that the member's chosen a dumb password, it's been leaked across the internet, they haven't chosen to opt into FA, the attacker might be a bot that we could use bot detection on, but it might also be a human that can solve any sort of, are you a human challenge. And ultimately, the members, we can't deploy a solution that's going to require members to significantly change their security behavior, because this is proven very difficult. So what we do, and what a number of sites out there do, Ellie alluded to Gmail using this, is scoring login attempts, right? So for every login attempt, you figure out, is this login suspicious? And then above some threshold, you require a second factor or require a challenge to be solved. And you have to make sure also that all your entry points are covered. So not just login with username and password, but also password reset. So for example, if the email address linked to the account is compromised, then the link goes out, the attacker initiates a password reset, the link goes to the compromised email, and boom, the attacker gets in. So anywhere that that you could get into the site, you need to do this kind of scoring. And the thresholds, again, as we saw in the previous talk, are our business's decision, a trade-off between false positives and false negatives. So I'm going to talk about our experiences with doing this kind of scoring and what we've proposed. So if we do see something suspicious and require a second factor, what could we require? So as I mentioned, you could prove you're a human through entering the text string or the new Google CAPTCHA, would you check an I am not a robot box. There's a more traditional second factor path through verifying a SMS or clicking a link in your email address. There's also a well-tested technique of repeating back information that you gave us earlier, so such as security questions or the email recovery that we saw in the Gmail talk. But all of these choices, the scoring and the challenges, come with trade-offs, right? So for one, there's a security versus usability trade-off, right? If we wanted everything to be perfectly secure, we could require a second factor on every login. But of course, this would be really annoying, and your users would stop using you and go to a different website. So that's not really a choice. We also need to choose the second factor appropriately for the occasion. If we think it's a bot, we could show a CAPTCHA. Depending on what we think it is, make the right choice. And it also needs to be easy to solve for good users and hard for bad guys. And in our experience, and our data has shown that SMS verification offers this large gap between easy for good guys and hard for bad guys. A number of years ago, we had something called a first name challenge, which was if we detect a suspicious login, we ask, please enter your first name. And it turned out that real users were terrible at remembering their first name. Either that their accounts were dormant and they couldn't remember what they had entered, or they simply didn't understand the question. It was not a good, not a long-term solution. This actually goes back to showing that it's hard to change users' behavior, right? Users know how to solve CAPTCHAs because they've seen them everywhere. Users know how to enter a PIN from an SMS. And when you say please enter your first name, some people will enter their email address. So here, how can we do the login scoring? Well, first we have to collect some data. So what data do we have? Well, we have everything that comes in the request. So for example, your IP address, from which we can do lookups for your ISP and country, et cetera. We have the reported browser that you're using, the timestamp, cookies, and other signals. For each of these elements, we have a reputation score. So I'll pick, for example, IP address. We know globally the history of that IP address across LinkedIn and all of that activity through the 400 million members, as well as all the non-logged in page views that we see. So we can calculate a reputation score for each IP address and use that in our scoring. We have counters, right? We can say how many logins have there been from this IP address in the past minute, hour, day, whatever, right? And we also have all the previous data for any given member, right? So we can look at the member's previous logins and say, does this login look like previous logins? And this look like is something that I want to dive a little deeper into. So we've actually found that heuristics can get you pretty far, right? So here's a user who's usually logs in from San Francisco, and well, if she logs in from New York, maybe that's not so bad. If she logs in from somewhere in the Indian Ocean, that could be a little bit suspicious. If she logs in from a computer that that we've tagged as being malicious, that's also probably not good. Or if there's some computer up in Alaska that's just hammering us with login requests and hits that account, that's probably also something that we would like to stop. And we found that these are pretty effective against large-scale or indiscriminate attacks. Right. So here's a couple of data points. We observed a fairly large bot attack about a year ago, and just the single feature of country mismatch was enough to block 99% of that attack. And by country mismatch, I mean the attempt was coming from a country that had not been seen in that user's previous login history. We saw another attack a little more recently where the attackers were a little bit smarter. 98% of them did match a country in the member's previous history, but they weren't smart about how quickly they went through their IPs, and we were able to block all of them through rate limiting. But as we've seen, attackers will adapt, and especially if there are targeted attacks, these heuristics could sometimes fail. So for example, if you're just looking at the country match heuristic, we found that 93% of our labeled compromised data set actually was matching a country from the member's previous login history. Whereas of legitimate logins, that number was 96%, so almost no difference. So this is where we want to get a little more fine-grained and look at it from a more statistical point of view. So ultimately, we're really just trying to decide which is more likely. Is this an attack, or is this legitimate for a given login? And that's really, so if you put it mathematically, is the ratio of these probabilities greater than 1? And actually, you could, if you want to do a more fine-grained scoring, you could replace that 1 with some threshold, and then above or below that threshold, take different actions. Again, this is a business decision based on challenging good users versus stopping bad users, or precision versus recall. So, okay, why can't we just take this formula, compute it from the data, and then be done? Well, so if you compute it from the data, you get a lot of zeros. And you'll say, oh, then great. No one's ever going to be attacked. But we want to get some non-zero probability estimate that any given login is an attack. So one problem is that we don't have any data on most members. The vast majority of members are never attacked, so we get 0 in the numerator. There's only a few samples, right? We have very sparse data. And what do we do if there's some, say, IP address that we've never even seen before? Then you get 0 in the numerator and the denominator, and you have no idea what to put as your estimate. So we can massage this formula a little bit and come up with the formula on the right-hand side, which is composed of 5 terms. I want to go through each of these and try to convince you that these are actually intuitive measures of what we might look for in a suspicious login. So the probability of an attack given the data. So X is the login data. If you want to be really concrete, think of X as the IP address. So I'll just hold that example in mind as I go through this. So the probability of an attack given IP address is rolled up into our asset reputation system. And we can look at not just account takeover attacks, but also any kind of bad activity on the site, such as fake accounts or spam or other kinds of fraud. And we have a system that tries to estimate this reputation, and we can normalize it into a probability. We have the global likelihood of seeing the particular IP address, say. And this can be computed from previous history and serves as sort of a prior on how likely something is to be logged, an IP address is to be logged in from, say. Here's the members data. So this is the appearance of, say, the IP address in that particular member's history. And it's in the denominator, right? So if that probability is higher, if they've often logged in from that IP, then it's more likely that that login is legitimate. There's also the value of an account to the attacker, right? So we have several internal metrics that measure the value of an account using things like number of connections, level of activity on the site, and this makes sense. A more valuable account is more likely to be attacked. And then also there's just the baseline likelihood of that member logging in. If you see somebody logging in, regularly or every day, then that member logging in again is less suspicious than if somebody was dormant for a long time and then logs in. So putting all these together, you can actually see that you can note that there's actually no per member attack data required to compute this formula, especially if you have a reputation system, or perhaps you could even get a reputation system from a third party. There are a number of vendors who maintain these sorts of things. And so this is good if you're trying to bootstrap a system or if you don't have good labeled data. If you do have labeled data, then you can get a little bit smarter, and you can weight these features. I put these as exponents. But if you take a logarithm, then this is a linear model that you can learn with logistic regression or any other classifier. So there's one question I haven't addressed, which is, how do we estimate a probability of something that we've never seen before? So for example, member comes in from a totally new IP address. So we address this with something called smoothing, which is a technique borrowed from natural language processing. And the idea is we arrange our features, so for example, IP address, we arrange them in hierarchies. So you have the IP address, which might belong to an ISP, which is part of a country, which is part of the world. Right? And the idea is that if you haven't seen a given IP address, but you have seen the member log in from that ISP, that's going to be more legitimate, less suspicious than if all the data is fresh, like they go to a totally new country, right? So this is making statistical that heuristic of country mismatch. Okay, so we built a prototype and ran some experiments. We'll note that these experiments only used 2 features, so in practice we use many more. And we found that the model gave us a little bit of a degradation in the botnet coverage, but greatly boosted the compromised account coverage. And when we combine it with the model and the heuristics, we got more than a 10 times boost for the compromised accounts without degrading the botnet coverage, and also at a lower false positive rate than this simple baseline statistic. So the full details of this model and more detailed experiments are in their upcoming paper to appear at NDSS. So I want to conclude just with a few takeaways. So first of all, protect all your users or members, right? Not just the ones who are consciously aware of protecting their security or maintaining the security of protecting themselves. Minimize friction, right? There's a security and friction trade-off, so take steps to only put friction in front of activity that you deem to be suspicious. Heuristics and machine learning work well together. Heuristics give you a good baseline, and the machine learning can plug the gaps. And finally, even if you don't have good labeled data, you can still use statistical modeling techniques to come up with your system. Thank you.